Hi, welcome back to Reads with Rune B. Thank you very much for watching my first videos. This is my third, and we are on the third chapter of A School for Good and Evil, where we find out more about what happens to Sophie and Agatha. The third chapter is called The Great Mistake. Sophie opened her eyes to find herself floating in a foul-smelling moat, filled to the brim with a thick, black sludge. A gloomy wall of fog flanked her on all sides. She tried to stand, but her feet couldn't find the bottom, and she sank. Sludge flooded her nose and burnt her throat. Choking for breath, she found something to grasp, and saw it was the carcass of a half-eaten goat. She gasped and tried to swim away, but couldn't see an inch in front of her face. Screams echoed above, and Sophie looked up. Streaks of motion. Then a dozen bony birds crashed through the fog and dropped shrieking children into the moat. When their screams turned to splashes, another wave of birds came, and then another, until every inch of the sky was filled with bawling children. Sophie glimpsed a bird dive straight for her, and she swerved, just in time to get a cannonball splash of slime in her face. She wiped the gloop out of her eyes and came face to face with a boy. The first thing she noticed was he had no shirt. His chest was puny and pale, without a hope of muscle. From his small head jutted a long nose, spiky teeth, and black hair that drooped over beady eyes. He was like a sinister weasel. "The bird ate my shirt," he said. "Can I touch your hair?" Sophie backed up. "They don't usually make villains with princess hair," he said, dog-paddling towards her. Sophie searched desperately for a weapon, a stick, a stone, a dead goat. "Maybe we could be bunkmates, or best mates, or some kind of mates," he said, inches from her now. It was like Radley had turned into a rodent and developed courage. He reached out a scrawny hand to touch her, and Sophie ready to punch to the eye, when a screaming child dropped between them. Sophie took off in the opposite direction, and by the time she glanced back, Weasel Boy was gone. Through the fog, Sophie could see shadows of children treading through floating bags and trunks, hunting for their luggage. Those that managed to find them continued downstream, toward the ominous howls in the distance. Sophie followed these floating silhouettes until the fog cleared to reveal the shore, where a pack of wolves, standing on 2 feet in blood-red soldier jackets and black leather breeches, snapped whips to herd students into line. And that's what they have in the illustration for the book for the wolves. So I'm going to show you guys the pictures that are here tonight. Isn't it cool? Sophie grasped the bank to pull herself out, but froze when she caught her reflection in the moat. Her dress was buried beneath sludge and yolk. Her hair was her face was shining. Let's try that again. Her dress was buried beneath sludge and yolk. Her face shined with stinky black grime, and her hair was home to a family of earthworms. She choked for breath. "Help! I'm in the wrong A wolf yanked her out and kicked her into line. She opened her mouth to protest, but saw Weasel Boy coming towards her, yelping, "Wait for me!" Quickly, Sophie joined the line of shadowed children, dragging their trunks through the fog. If any dawdled, a wolf delivered a swift crack. so she kept an anxious pace, all the while wiping her dress, picking out worms, and mourning her perfectly packed bags far, far away. The tower gates were made of iron spikes, crisscrossed with barbed wire. Nearing them, she saw it wasn't wire at all, but a sea of black vipers that darted and hissed in her direction. With a squeak, Sophie scampered through and looked back at the rusted words over the gate, held between two carved black swans. The School for Evil Edification and Propagation of Sin. Ahead, the school tower rose like a winged demon. The main tower, built of pock-marked black stone, unfurled through smoky clouds like a hulking torso. From the sides of the main tower jutted two thick, crooked spires, dripping with viny red creepers like bleeding wings. The wolves drove the children towards the mouth of the main tower, a long, serrated tunnel shaped like a crocodile's snout. Sophie felt chills as the tunnel grew narrower and narrower, until she could barely see the child in front of her. She squeezed between two jagged stones and found herself in a leaky foyer that smelled of rotten fish. Demonic gargoyles pitched down from stone rafters, lit torches in their jaws. An iron statue of a bald, toothless hag brandishing an apple smoldering in the menacing firelight. Along the wall, a crumbly column had an enormous black letter N painted on it, decorated with wicked-faced imps, trolls, and harpies, climbing up and down it like a tree. There was a blood-red E on the next column, embellished with swinging giants and goblins creeping along in an interminable line. Sophie worked out what the column spelled out. Never. N-E-V-E-R. And then suddenly found herself far enough into the room to see the line snake in front of her. For the first time, she had a clear view of the other students and almost fainted. One girl had a hideous overbite, wispy patches of hair, and one eye instead of two, right in the middle of her forehead. Another boy was like a mound of dough, with his bulging belly, bald head, and swollen limbs. A tall, sneering girl trudged ahead with sickly green skin. The boy in front of her had so much hair all over him, he could have been an ape. They all looked about her age, but similarities ended there. Here was a mass of the miserable, with misshapen bodies, repulsive faces, and the cruelest expressions she'd ever seen, as if looking for something to hate. One by one their eyes fell on Sophie, and they found what they were looking for. The petrified princess in glass slippers and golden curls, the red rose among the thorns. On the other side of the moat, Agatha nearly killed a fairy. She had woken under red and yellow lilies that appeared to be having an animated conversation. Agatha was sure she was the subject, for the lilies gestured brusquely at her with their leaves and buds. But then the matter seemed settled, and the flowers hunched like fussing grandmothers and wrapped their stems around her wrist with a tug. They yanked her to her feet, and Agatha gazed out at a field of other girls, blooming gloriously around a shivering lake. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The girls grew right from the earth. First heads poked through the soft dirt, then necks, then chests, then up until they stretched their arms into fluffy blue sky and planted delicate slippers upon the ground. But it wasn't just the sight of sprouting girls that unnerved Agatha most. It was that these girls looked nothing like her. Their faces, some fair, some dark, were flawless and glowed with health. They had shiny waterfalls of hair, and ironed and curled like dolls. They wore downy dresses of peach, yellow, white, like a fresh batch of Easter eggs. Some fell on the shorter side, others were willowy and tall, but all flaunted tiny waists, slim legs, and slight shoulders. I'm going to stop for a minute and take a drink. As the field flourished with new students, a team of 3 glitter-winged fairies awaited each one. Chiming and chinkling, they dusted the girls of dirt, poured them cups of honeybush tea, and tended to their trunks, which had sprung to the ground by their owners. Where exactly these beauties were coming from, Agatha hadn't the faintest idea. All she wanted was a dour or disheveled one to poke through so that she wouldn't feel so out of place. But it was an endless bloom of Sophies, who had everything she didn't. A familiar shame clawed at her stomach. She needed a hole to climb down, a graveyard to hide in, something to make them all go away. And that's when the fairy bit her. What the? Agatha tried to shake the jingling thing off her hand, but it flew and bit her neck, and then her bottom. The other fairies tried to subdue the rogue as she yelled, but it bit them too and attacked Agatha again. Incensed, she tried to catch the fairy, but it moved lightning quick, so she hopped around uselessly while he bit her over and over, until the fairy mistakenly flew into her mouth and she swallowed it. Agatha sighed in relief and looked up. 60 beautiful girls gaped at her. The cat in a nightingale's nest. Agatha felt a pinch in her throat and coughed out the fairy. To her surprise, it was a boy. In the distance, sweet bells rang out from the spectacular pink and blue glass castle across the lake. Teams of fairies all grabbed their girls by the shoulders, hoisted them into the air, and flew them across the lake towards the tower. Agatha saw her chance to escape, but before she could make a run for it, she felt herself lifted into the air by 2 girl fairies. As she flew away, she glanced back at the third, the boy fairy that had bitten her, who stayed firmly on the ground, crossed his arms, and shook his head, as if to say, in no uncertain terms, there had been a terrible mistake. Then the fairies brought the girls down in front of the glass castle. They let go of their shoulders and let them proceed freely. But Agatha's 2 fairies held on and dragged her forward like a prisoner. Agatha looked back across the lake. Where's Sophie? The crystal water turned into a slimy moat halfway across the lake. Grey fog obscured whatever lay on the opposite banks. If Agatha was to rescue her friend, she had to find a way across the moat. But first, she needed to get away from these winged pests. She needed a diversion. The mirrored words arched over the golden gates ahead. The School for Good, Enlightenment, and Enchantment. Agatha caught her reflection in the letters and turned away. She hated mirrors and avoided them at all costs. Pigs and dogs don't sit around looking at themselves, she thought. Moving forward, Agatha glanced up at the frosted castle doors, emblazoned with 2 white swans. But as the doors opened, the fairies herded the girls into a tight, mirrored corridor. The line came to a halt, and a group of girls circled her like sharks. They stared at her for a moment, as if expecting her to whip off her mask and reveal a princess underneath. Agatha tried to meet their stares. but instead met her own face reflected in the mirrors 1,000 times, and instantly glued her eyes to the marble floor. A few fairies buzzed to get the mass moving, but most just perched on girls' shoulders and watched. Finally, one of the girls stepped forward, with waist-length gold hair, succulent lip, and topaz eyes. She was so beautiful she didn't look real. "Hello, I'm Beatrix," she said sweetly. "I didn't catch your name." "That's because I never said it, Agatha." Eyes pinned to the ground. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Beatrix said, even sweeter now. Agatha felt a word swim into her mind. A word she needed, but it was still too foggy to see. Perhaps you just swam to the wrong school," smiled Beatrix. The word lit up in Agatha's head. Diversion. "This is a school for good, isn't it? The legendary school for beautiful and worthy girls destined to be princesses." "Oh," said Beatrix, lips pursed. "So you're not lost." "Or confused," said another with Arabian skin and jet black hair. "Or blind," said a third with deep ruby curls. "In that case, I'm sure you have your Flower Ground pass," Beatrix said. Agatha blinked. "My what?" "Your ticket into the Flower Ground," said Beatrix. "You know, the way we all got here. The only officially accepted students have tickets to the Flower Ground." All the girls held up large golden tickets, flaunting their names in regal calligraphy, stamped with the schoolmaster's black and white swan seal. "Oh, that Flower Ground pass," Agatha scoffed. She dug her hands in her pockets. "Come close and I'll show you." The girls gathered suspiciously. Meanwhile, Agatha's hands fumbled for a diversion. Matches, coins, dry leaves. Closer," murmuring girls huddled in. "It shouldn't be this small," Beatrix huffed. "Shrunk in the wash," said Agatha, scraping through more matches, melted chocolate. A headless bird. Reaper hid them in her clothes. "It's in here somewhere." "Perhaps you lost it," said Beatrix. "Mothballs, peanut shells, another dead bird." "Or misplaced it." "A bird, the match, light the bird with a match, or lied about having one." "At all?" "Oh, I feel it now." But all Agatha felt was the nervous rash creeping across her neck. "You know what happens to intruders, don't you? Here it is. Do something." The girls crowded around her ominously. "Do something now." She did. The first thing she thought of, and delivered a swift, loud fart. An effective diversion creates both chaos and panic. Agatha delivered on both counts. Vile fumes ripped through the tight corridors. Squealing girls stamped for cover, and fairies swooned at the first smell, leaving her a clear path to the door. Only Beatrix stood in her way, too shocked to move. Agatha took a step forward and leaned in like a wolf. "Boo!" And Beatrix fled for her life. As Agatha sprinted for the door, she looked back with pride as girls collided into walls and trampled each other to escape. Fixed on rescuing Sophie, she lunged through the frosted doors, ran to the lake, but just as she got to it, the waters rose up in a giant wave with a tidal crash and slammed her back through the doors, through screeching girls, until she landed on her stomach in a puddle. She staggered to her feet, frozen. "Welcome, new princess," said a floating 7-foot nymph. It moved aside to reveal a foyer so magnificent Agatha lost her breath. "Welcome to the school for good." Sophie couldn't get over the smell of the place. As she lurched along with the line, she gagged on a mix of unwashed bodies, mildewed stone, and stinking wolf. Sophie stood on her tiptoes to see where the line was headed, but all she could see was an endless parade of freaks. The other students threw her dirty looks, but she responded with her kindest smile, in case this was a test. It had to be a test, or a glitch, or a joke, or something. She turned to a gray wolf. "Not that I question your authority, but might I see the schoolmaster? I think he—" The wolf roared, soaking her with spit. Sophie didn't press the point. She slumped into line with a sunken anteroom. She slumped with the line into a sunken anteroom, where 3 black, crooked staircases twisted up in a perfect row. One carved with monsters said malice along the banister. The second, etched with spiders, said mischief. And the third, with snakes, read vice. Around the 3 staircases, Sophie noticed the walls were covered with different colored frames. In each frame there was a portrait of a child, next to a storybook painting of what the student became upon graduation. A gold frame had a portrait of an elfish little girl. Beside it, a magnificent drawing of her as a revolting witch, standing over a comatose maiden. A golden plaque stretched under 2 illustrations. Catherine of Foxwood, Little Snow White villain. In the next gold frame there was a portrait of a smirking boy with a thick unibrow, alongside a painting of him all grown up and brandishing a knife to a woman's throat. Drogon of Murmuring Mountains, Bluebeard villain. Beneath Drogon there was a silver frame of a skinny boy with shock blonde hair, turned into one of a dozen ogres savaging a village. Keir of Netherwood, Tom Thumb, henchman. Then Sophie noticed a decayed bronze frame near the bottom with a tiny bald boy and scared wide eyes. She knew the boy. Bane was his name. He used to bite all the pretty girls in Gabaldon until he was kidnapped 4 years before. There was no drawing next to Bane, just a rusted plaque that read, "Failed." Sophie looked at Bane's terrified face and felt her stomach churn. What happened to him? She gazed up at thousands of gold and silver and bronze frames, cramming every inch of the hall. Witches slaying princesses, giants devouring men, demons igniting children, heinous ogres, grotesque gorgons, headless horsemen, merciless sea monsters, once awkward adolescents, now portraits of absolute evil. The evil villains that had died gruesome deaths: Rumpelstiltskin, the Beanstalk Giant, the wolf from Red Riding Hood, they were all drawn in their greatest moments, as if they had emerged triumphant from their tails. Sophie's gut took another twist when she noticed the other children gazing up at the portraits in awed worship. It hit her with sick clarity. She was in line with future murderers and monsters. Her face broke out in a cold sweat. She needed to find a faculty member, someone who could search the list for enrolled students, and see she was in the wrong school. But so far, all she could find were wolves that couldn't speak, let alone read a list. Turning the corner into a wider corridor, Sophie saw a red-skinned, horned dwarf ahead on a towering stepladder, hammering more portraits into a bare wall. Her teeth clenched with hope as she inched toward him in line. As she plotted to get his attention, Sophie suddenly noticed the frames on this wall held familiar faces. There was the hoggish doughboy she had seen earlier, labeled Braun of Rochbriar. Next to him was a painting of a one-eyed, wispy-haired girl, Arachne of Foxwood. Sophie scanned the portraits of her classmates, awaiting their villainous transformations. Her eyes stopped on Weaselboy. Hort of Bloodbrook. Hort sounds like a disease. She moved ahead in line, ready to cry to the dwarf, and then she saw the frame under his hammer. Her own face smiled back at her. With a shriek, Sophie bolted out of line, fumbled up the ladder, and snatched the portrait from the dwarf's stunned fingers. "No, I'm in good," she shouted, but the dwarf snatched it back, and the two tussled over the portrait, kicking and clawing until Sophie had enough and gave him a slap. The dwarf screamed like a little girl and swung at her with his hammer. Sophie dodged it, but lost her balance, and the stepladder teetered and crashed between the walls. Splayed out on rungs in midair, she looked down at snarling wolves and goggling students. "I need to see the schoolmaster," and then lost her grip, slid across the ladder, and landed in a heap at the front of the line. A dark-skinned hag with a massive boil on her cheek thrust a sheet of parchment into her hands. This is Sophie's class schedule, just so you guys can see. I don't know how well that shows. Session 1, Uglification. Professor Bilious Manley. Henchman Training, Castor. Curses and Death Traps, Lady Alesso. History of Villainy, Professor August Sader. Lunch. Special Talents, Professor Sheba Sheiks. Surviving Fairy Tales, Yubaba the Gnome. Forest Group 3. And that's Sophie's schedule. The dark-skinned hag, with a massive boil on her cheek, thrust a sheet of parchment into her hands. Sophie looked up, dumbstruck. See you in class, Witch of the Woods Beyond," the hag croaked. Before Sophie could respond, an ogre dumped a ribbon-tied sack of books in her arms. Best Villainous Monologues, 2nd edition. Spells for Suffering, Year 1. A Novice's Guide to Kidnap and Murder. Embracing Ugliness, Inside and Out. How to Cook Children, with new recipes. The books were bad enough, but then Sophie saw the ribbon tying them was a live eel. She screamed and dropped the books, before a spotted satyr foisted musty black fabric at her. Unfurling it, Sophie shrank from the dumpy, tattered tunic that sagged like shredded curtains. She gaped at the other girls, gleefully putting on the putrid uniform, combing through their books and comparing schedules. Sophie slowly looked down at her own foul black robes, then at her eel-slimed books and schedules, then at her sweetly smiling portrait on the back of the wall. Then at her smiling, sweet portrait back on the wall. She ran for her life. Agatha knew she was in the wrong place, because even the faculty gave her confused looks. Together they lined 4 spiral staircases of the cavernous glass foyer, 2 of them pink, 2 blue, showering confetti upon the new students. The female professors wore different colored versions of the same slim, high-necked dress with glittering silver swan crest over the heart. Each added a personal touch to the dress. Whether inlaid crystals, bead flowers, or even a tulle bow. Male professors, meanwhile, all wore bright, slim suits in a rainbow of hues, paired with matching vests and narrow ties and colorful kerchiefs tucked into pockets embroidered with the same silver swan. Agatha noticed immediately that they were all more attractive than any adult she had ever seen.